And yes, we have talked about politics today in Europe, we have talked about history, we have talked about economy, and now it's time to talk about the soul of Europe. It's quite an eternal issue, and certainly will not cover all that issue, but let's try to provoke ourselves and to think about few issues today that would maybe provoke us for new deeds, for new ideas, for new projects in next 100 years of Europe to come. So I would like to start with one interesting title of the screenplay that I found was issued 100 years ago, exactly on 7th of May. And it tells us the struggle for soul between love and hate. So the struggle of soul. That's actually a screenplay by the US writer Richard Correll. And yes, if you would ask me what is it all about, it's kind of drama of machinations, and somebody got killed and somebody was unfairly imprisoned, and then some other lady was forced to marriage. Yes, quite a dramatic story in the very end of the First World War time in the world. That's about emotions, but we know how much emotions play a role into our lives, not just into our lives as personal beings, but also in lives of individual states and also sometimes continents even. So let's try to find out what has emotions to do with us 100 years ago and today, and maybe some decades in the future, at least what we are forming today as a future. So, we have 4 distinguished speakers today. We have to talk about the antagonisms in the last century. We have to talk about the kind of robust dance and sometimes even evil dance between the democracy and the authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes, and what lessons we have today. And what maybe new skills we have to acquire today, having those lessons in hand. Well, actually, I would like to start maybe also by a provoking question that this year is the year of European cultural heritage. And today is exactly a very good time to think what kind of heritage we leave as this generation for other generations to come. What kind of heritage we are forming today with our deeds, with our thoughts, and with our projects. And yes, on 7th of May or any other day. I would like to give floor now to our speakers, and we have 4 speakers from different countries, and 2 are from Lithuania. One is from Montenegro, and the other one is from Latvia. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Rytis Zemkauskas. He comes from Lithuania, from Kaunas, and I don't know whom he represents today, either a journalist or writer or cultural philosopher. You are also representing here Kaunas as the upcoming European Capital of Culture in 2022. So I know that you have kind of provoking story, and that's why I would like to give the floor to you, somehow to shake us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iva. Thank you for having me as someone whose father is born on Lithuanian-Latvian border. I feel very much at home in both countries. So this could be my identity for today, maybe the best identity that I can present here. I will proceed in that manner, in that intimate manner, basically, and I will start with an empirical example. It is not very academic, but I'm a journalist all of my life, and I'm an academician just recently. And that example occurred very recently, so it is not even time-tested. But nevertheless, I have a friend, and he is an academician from the United States, from California. He is of Lithuanian descent, and just a few days ago we had this hot discussion with him about whether or not politicians have a right to hush down journalists. And at one point I made a suggestion that some journalists basically could be hushed down, because in my country some of them are not very professional, some of them knowingly spread propaganda, some of them spread fake news. My friend's reaction was furious. He said, "This is unacceptable, shame on you, I will not talk to you." So it took me 1 hour to think, and then I took my words back. And it was public, it was on Facebook. So I have taken my words back because I had to admit that democracy cannot be a subject to exceptions or conditions. That either there is a democracy or there is no democracy. Either there is free speech or there is no free speech. Mistakes and wrongdoings, they cannot affect the core principles based on values. And finally, I realized that my instinct for exceptions and conditionality is very much Soviet. And realization of this sort is very painful because you are a subject and an object at the same time. A captive mind trying to analyze a captive mind, as Czesław Miłosz, the poet I love, would probably say. And I really often feel like, an amateur Dr. House, trying to cure his own virus. And I could be very wrong about symptoms. They may be elusive, they may be obscured, they may be false, but nevertheless, I have no option but to suggest that there is a virus, and this virus is called Sovietism. And I suggest that it's in my mind. It's multiple and it's sexually transmitted because I pass it down to my children, as my patterns of behavior, as my judgments, the examples that they see. So yes, it is personal. It is very, very much personal. But I think that I am not the only one with it, and I think I am not the only one with an expressed desire to get better. So therefore, I think that deeper analysis of what Sovietism is and how it works in our minds on everyday basis could present some important answers to the challenges that we have in modern Europe. First and foremost, as Soviets quite righteously put it, Sovietism is an ideology. So, as my example with free press shows, they have succeeded in implementing this ideology far better than I would like to admit sometimes. They have managed to put some particular mindset in place, and this mindset, to my mind, is in process of revealing itself to astonished audiences across Europe right at the moment we speak. Let me outline very briefly some of these symptoms, at least those that I can put my finger on. One of the most important symptoms is that Sovietism basically is a general distrust within the society. The Soviet imperative establishes that institutions, organizations, and people cannot be trusted and therefore respected. The government cannot be trusted and therefore cannot be of any positive use. A person cannot be trusted, therefore cannot be left to his or her own devices, and therefore should be controlled by means of regulations, laws, the more the better. This leads to derivatives such as government and people dichotomy, in which government is greedy, bad and stupid, and people always poor, helpless and disillusioned. And also, Soviet imperative, at least in my country, always holds that there cannot be such thing as something done pro bono, something done out of selfless impulse. There's always something behind everything, says Soviet imperative. And another one, very important feature of Sovietism to my mind is the shortcut culture that we have in my society. I'm generalizing here, but this is the only way to present things. Shortcut culture. By shortcut culture, I mean all possible ways of doing things faster than they should be done. And one more tendency I observe in my society could be called a tendency to believe in conflicting ideas and sustain a system of conflicting values. Well, the simplest example could be, of course, pay fewer taxes and get more benefits from the state, but more complicated thing is that we have people who feel victims in their own country. And this creates a strange mix of passiveness and impatience. And it distorts democratic processes to the extent that all types of saviors and quick fixes are suddenly very desirable. And the last but not least, I would call an imperative of unrealistic expectations. You know, to get rich very soon, to see democracy as a set of liberties where everything is allowed, free speech as an opportunity to express hate, hatred, something like that. Of course, all the above mentioned elements, to my mind, they don't seem endemic to my own country, or even to post-Soviet space-time. I would say that I see those elements in many societies, post-colonial, post-fascist, and even in the proverbial, or as it was put today, vintage democratic societies. We see it happening around Europe now. So therefore, I think that very important contribution we, as a post-Soviet time states, could make to the new Europe is exactly this. We can bring forward all possible mindset patterns that we have and to analyze them very openly and to show how it works and how it could be dealt with. So, to put it shortly, we can be a vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rytis. And I have two questions straight ahead. One is regarding the European Capital of Culture. As you're representing European Capital of Culture, Kaunas in 2022, talking about those lessons you have in your head and brains and emotions, I wanted to ask, what do you want to change by this program and the whole concept of the European Capital of Culture? What society you would like to see in some 1 decade's time in Kaunas, in Lithuania, in Europe?
So, well, one of the goals, of course, is to change exactly this, what I was talking about, to change the mindset, because culture, to my mind, and as we understand it in the Capital of Culture project, culture is a way to do things. So we must change our ways. If we want to get better, if we want to get better society, richer society, more happy society, this is what I'm talking about. So we have to change these, we have to find weak points and we have to change these things that doesn't satisfy us. And to my mind, the European Capital of Culture project is not about big celebrations. It shouldn't be about big celebrations. There will be celebrations, don't worry. Fireworks shows, it'll be there, yeah. But it's not the most important part of it. To my mind, the legacy is the most important part of it. To implement those changes and to seek to make them permanent as they could possibly be, because there is no such thing as a permanent state. So legacy is the most important, and changes in mindset are the most important. This is how we see it at the Capital of Culture in Kaunas 2022.
Thank you, Yet. Another question regarding journalism today in Europe and free speech. As we know, we had lately 2 assassinations of investigative journalists, one in Malta and one in Slovakia. And I would like to hear your comments, as we are talking about democracy in Europe at the moment. And what does it mean, these 2 assassinations? Yes, you are a journalist. Maybe you could give us your opinion on that.
Yeah, and as I said, I have a killer's mindset as well. It is a very complicated question, and in Malta, Valletta is a capital of culture in 2018. It is now a capital of culture, and they have this huge scandal. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the details, but I could say that democracy cannot have exceptions, and right for free speech cannot have exceptions. So this is unacceptable, and I could attribute it to some sort of a post-colonial set of mind, some sort of dramas that societies like this experience all over the world and in Europe as well. So I think that culture is capable to change things. These changes are slow but permanent and with longer lasting effects. So hopefully we will learn these lessons, and hopefully we will learn to understand these things more properly. So this is the only thing that I can say.
Thank you, and I would like to give the floor now to the other speaker from Lithuania, Mr. Šarūnas Liekis, and you're a professor and the Dean of the School of Political Science and Diplomacy at Vytautas Magnus University. So I know that you have been always defending very depoliticized research, and that is something that we would maybe really need when talking about research in history in order to build some kind of better future, as we love to say. So maybe you could give us your opinion on these issues that we have started.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the possibility to be here in this respected audience. And starting from your question, I would like to move immediately into the essence of our contemporary statehood. In a sense, we all live in national states which are based on ideas of 19th century nationalism, and usually we looked retrospectively into the past. You know, we live in a world where basically the Flintstones, probably most of you saw one or another series of so-called animated sitcom or situational comedy produced by Americans, one of the most popular. It lasted for 30 years. And this sitcom actually was the most successful franchise of any time in the movie industry. Basically, the Flintstones show the past in the Stone Age, or Flint Age, you can say, you know, and people are functioning in this age like nowadays. Basically, they have cars, they have airplanes, they are flying dragons, and, you know, all kinds of interesting stuff is going around. So basically, our thinking is that, contemporary Latvians, contemporary Lithuanians, in the 13th century, or if somebody saw this new movie produced in Latvia, like Namie Gredzens, probably some of you saw it, about Zemgalian, revolt. So for many of the people, I mean, they don't make a real difference between the present and the past. I'm not saying that the movie is bad, but in some of the reviews I saw that commentators and the critics of the movie are writing about the Roman Empire, which was trying to expand its influence in the Eastern Baltics. I was surprised. I knew only Saint Roman Empire, which is completely different state and functioned on completely non-imperial, very often, most often, principles. So this kind of mistakes and retrospective viewing of the past is, in a sense, I would say, damaging our present. How it's damaging our present? Basically, all our states, despite the discussions in the previous sessions, for example, we saw, discussions on economy or in politics, somehow Latvia and Estonia were together, Lithuanians were left aside, in all these discussions, if you noticed, I mean, those who are the whole day here. So there is this perception that Lithuania somehow is different, historically maybe, politically, but I would say probably the main thing is that Lithuanian history is viewed differently, as Lithuanians are seen like kind of historical nation, quote unquote, and which had, statehood, Grand Duchy, then Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a joint state between Poland and Lithuania, and it lasted for a few centuries, while Estonia and Latvia was always, more or less under subjugation of the neighboring powers. However, the issue is that here we're using, kind of classification introduced by Hroch, by a Czech historian, and who basically was claiming that, he was making differences about the historical and non-historical nations, and the main criteria was continuation of the elites. I mean, if there is a continuation of the ethos, ideas, lifestyle of the elites from generation to generation, then you have historical nation, in a sense. So from that point of view, Lithuania is also not much historical, because the continuation is also, difficult to prove, though in part, you can claim that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century with the independence, part of the former elites basically joined so-called the Litvoman, or lovers of Lithuania, movement, and who are basically supportive of Lithuanian independence, its separation from Poland, etc., etc. Though the very elites were heavily, culturally part of this binary, nation of Polish nobility, and this nobility was in Polish Kingdom and Grand Duchy of Lithuania, though all of them saw differences, but they created their own culture, which was, they claimed to be Sarmatic, culture, different, it's not related to the peasantry. Let it be Polish-speaking peasantry in Kingdom of Poland or Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Lithuanian-speaking peasantry. So they thought of themselves as a different nation. But so part of this former nobility, joined the Lithuanian movement, but in essence, all modern nationalism and modern nationhood of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is based on linguistic nationalism. I mean, and this correlates with the country's peasant origins and the eventual emancipation of the state. And this naturally is a great opportunity for democratization, for legitimacy, etc., etc., etc. However, it's in most of the cases, we suffer, all of our countries suffer from discontinuity. In a sense, it's not only that we have a problem to prove, continuity of us being here, but the problem is that basically on what values should we base our present-day politics, economics, existence, etc., etc. So this discontinuity is heavily felt, I think, by all. I think Lithuanians are not an exception. You know, all the recent attempts to integrate somehow this heritage of the Grand Duchy of the Middle Ages into the present identity were partial or only partially successful. And sometimes emerging tensions between Poland and Lithuania over cultural issues is just simple expression and very basic expression of these, you know, let's say, identity-related tensions. Also, basically, because we cannot refer to easily to the, let's say, golden age of democracy, of nobility democracy of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths for ideological reasons. So, let's say, interwar period and interwar authoritarian dictatorships in all Baltic countries are heavily weighing on us. In the previous discussions we had, you know, like, and Marek mentioned about the strong state of Latvia. I think we can rephrase this question. We can say, I'm not criticizing Marek. Marek is, you know, absolutely right. But the problem is that it's not only strong state, but I would say weak civil society. You can imagine if you introduce this kind of reforms in France, you wouldn't have a brick on the brick tomorrow. And what would state, what would prime minister, etc., would do in these circumstances when somebody would raise, you know, Antifa flag on St. Peter's Dome? I don't know. So, so the policies introduced, you know, in these countries, where I'm talking about all the Baltic countries, very often not meeting any resistance of the society. Society is not expressing itself, and society is not defending its own public interest. And these projections into the interwar period very often, and because of the needs in the interwar period, for example, to build, you know, basic education system. It was not a problem in Latvia and Estonia because literacy was very high, but for example in Lithuania, the problem with literacy was urgent. At the same time, you had very strong kind of neglect for the higher culture in the country, saying that you don't need, you know, too many educated people. You have to have kind of this basic education, literate, heavy laborers who would work in the fields, in the factories, or wherever. And basically, these references, these cultural references, when you look in nowadays, I mean, the attempt to do, you know, public sector reform wherever, let it be Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, probably it's easier case. But, you know, for example, Latvia or Lithuania, basically you encounter once again the same neglect for education, for well-being of the citizenry as a whole, for the public good as a whole. So these tendencies and these immediate historical references which are coming, you know, to our mind because we are taught about the interwar period probably the best, I mean, out of all generations, I mean, because this is the immediate reference period to which we are referring. So these things are still heavily weighing on us. So my argument would be, and then I am happy, you know, to continue on the discussion because I don't want to take too much of your time. I would say that instead of the Flintstones, we should watch more The Simpsons about the current middle class life and all the situations which are coming, you know, and how people are creatively trying to resolve all the situations. I mean, with all the difficulties, with all the mishaps, with all the stupidities of everyday life, in a sense, we should be more creative, self-relying, in a sense, without any kind of stubborn preconditions about how things should be. I think for all the three Baltic countries it would bring more diversity, dynamism, and less of accountant's mentality, which is very clearly seen in our days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like a bit to rephrase your last sentences, saying that maybe we shouldn't watch too many Simpsons or others, but actually make and create new stories and make the stories we would really love to see in New Europe of the next century. And maybe we'll have comments on the higher education later on from Professor Auzinch. But now I would like to jump from Baltics to Balkans, as we are certainly sometimes joking that nobody can remember in the world whether we come from Baltics or from Balkans. Is it bad or is it good, or what can we do about it? How can we change our images, etc.? And my formula actually is always, when I'm saying that I'm coming from Latvia, from the Baltics, I usually add that it's located by the Baltic Sea in the northern Europe. So, Rados, you are coming from Balkans. You will say your own formula where Balkans is when somebody from far away asks you. But you are representing us here, Montenegrin civil society. You are a journalist yourself. Sorry, I didn't mention your surname. It's Rados Mus. And you are also, as I understand, a strong believer in European values. And maybe you, listening to all these stories today from different countries and mainly from the Baltic region, maybe you could give us your comments on these topics. How does it sound to you?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I really need to thank the audience. They stayed until the last panel, and I know that it's really difficult and hard after so many coffee breaks and lunches, so bravo to you. Well, I mean, my formula is when I say that I'm from the Balkans, people usually ask me if there's a war there. And the second thing, when I say I'm from Montenegro, they ask me what side of Africa it is. So I don't get mad because there's around 600,000 Montenegrins like on this planet. So we are very accustomed to this conversation. But as you said, I am very EU and European oriented because for us there's no other option. And I'll try to through this, I hope very short, but it usually isn't speech, to explain what is the role and where is the position of the Western Balkans in your story, in the story of the European Union, in the story of Europe, and in the specific focus of building European identity, which I think that it's like one of the most important topics when you talk about development of Europe. I mean, I know that it's like not easy to catch it, to touch it, what is the European identity, but I think it's one of the topics that has to be open on every conference about Europe, because that's the ground for any kind of development, political, economical, culture, etc., etc. I had a concept prepared today for this conference, it was different than the one that I'm gonna present now, because I heard the speech of Ms. Freiberga, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and I really tore down my paper and I said, okay, I'm going to focus on this. Because throughout this conference, there was one issue that was really important, and it is how do we understand our history and what lessons did we learn. In my opinion, in Europe in general, and especially in the Western Balkans or in the Balkans, we tend to hide from historical lessons, or tend to be very picky around them, or we are very slow with the learning process. And so I will focus on what is the role of the Western Balkans, and throughout this, please bear with me, I will try to explain how the Western Balkans can help to refresh the European Union and to refresh the story about the European identity and European citizenship. So Churchill, I was drinking yesterday I had a drink with my friend in one of the bars in Riga. It was a great Latvian sun. I really enjoyed it, and we talked about the Yugoslav or the Western Balkan history. We made it until the third drink. I'm not going to say if it was alcoholic, and then we just gave up. Because it is really difficult to explain what happened in the Western Balkans and how the conflict started and what is the product of the conflict. It's so complicated. But I remembered something that Winston Churchill said, and he said that the Balkans produce more history than they can consume. And it's true. It is really true. But I would say that currently the Balkans produce more processes, bad or negative or positive ones, that the European institutions and the European Union can consume or can understand, which is a problem for the future enlargement. So why are we talking about the Balkans? There is this great speech from Zoran Đinđić. He was the late or the first democratic prime minister of Serbia, and it was given in the Churchill Symposium in Switzerland, where he compared the European Union as a nice house. And the house, he says, there was a family, there was a lot of brothers and sisters, they were fighting a lot, but at one moment, there was a peace moment, they created this lovely house and said, this house is lovely. But what if near the house there is a place where there is trash, disease, wild animals, a place in your neighborhood that's not, you know, cleaned, that's a sort of disease of drugs, organized crime, no democracy, or simulation of democracy. What happens to that nice house is not worthy anymore. If you're in your neighborhood, you have bad places, you cannot rent it high. So what he said very pragmatically, in a not so very diplomatic manner, is that we are your neighborhood. If you don't deal with us, you're gonna get problems in the future. And I think that's the story of the Western Balkans. It's a hole in the middle of Europe that needs to be dealt with. And the issue is, the only problem is, and the question is the European Union dealing with it in a correct manner? The current state in the Western Balkans and the current players in the identity fight is, you have the European Union with its soft power. A lot of technocrats, a lot of money, a lot of delegation, etc., etc. Then you have the Russians, who are really, really active currently there, but they're active in building all various sorts of identities. And as we all know, and Latvians know the best, they're very good at the propaganda game, especially in the countries who are more Orthodox-oriented, etc., etc. The third player is Turkey. There are Muslim countries in the Western Balkans. Turkey has a very good approach to them, and a very good approach to the political parties who are Bosnian or Muslim-oriented. And this is an issue that will be a problem in the future, because now we have a lot of problems, especially with Turkey asking all the Balkan countries to shut down probably, or I don't know, Gulenist-oriented schools and similar. So Turkey is also a power that's building some sorts of identities. And there's China, who is building now a connection with the Western Balkans in the sense of money, but also connecting to the countries that were connected to China through the old Yugoslavia. So there are so many influences in the Western Balkans, and I'm not sure that the European Union is completely understanding this. Why is the process of the European integration so important for the building of identity? I think one of the best chances of European Union currently is to try to find mechanisms to build European identity in the Western Balkan countries. Why? In Albania and Kosovo, there's 80% support to the European Union and to the European integration. In Montenegro, there's 70%, or it varies from 70 to 76% to the European Union. In other countries, similar. In Serbia, which is often seen as a Russian player in the region, there's around 50% support to the European Union. So now compare it to the European Union member states. And you see that this is a great chance for the European Union to build the identities of its future citizens, so it can have more support throughout it. What is the mistake of the European Union, or the Europe in general? It communicates only with the governments. or it outsources everything. Sometimes for civil society, which NGOs do very well, but the problem in the region is the European Commission says our partners are the government, which is wrong. The partners of the European Union in any external country should be the citizens of those countries. I will shut it up. And what is very important for us is that young people mostly support European Union and feel that they do belong to Europe. Unfortunately, this is not well understood by the European institutions. And the second thing, unfortunately, EU communicates in the Balkans through money. So often you would have this headshot, the big shot, a politician or a commissioner saying, we invested 150 million to this or that. The problem is that in the Western Balkans, so much money was lost on development aid because of the conflict, that people really, and that's not Paris, that's not Frankfurt, that's not London. People do not understand the money as they understand in capitalistic countries. So the problem is that people don't relate with that support. And I think that that should be a lesson that's learned. I know that I went too far. The conclusion of the whole story is, the Western Balkans, especially Serbia and Montenegro, as I understood by the Western Balkan strategy of the Commission, will very soon, or one moment in the next 10 or 15 years, be the members of the European Union. The question is, will they be new Bulgaria, Romania, or I can say Hungary, or will there be a new chance for the refreshment of the European identity and maybe through creation of European citizenship? Thank you.
Thank you, but I straight ahead have a question to you, because we heard about institutions in Europe, we heard about how much people like belonging to the Europe, etc. But actually my question was regarding what is your civil society doing, because you are representing a civil society, and we are not talking so much here who is guilty where, but what you as civil society can take as an action in regards to maybe your politicians, culture in politics as such. So that is something that is the homework, and that's not for us here, for example, in Baltics to judge. But so maybe you could just a little bit elaborate on
sorry, I get
civil society.
really dramatic and get lost in the points sometimes. I think there's a big difference between civil society. I spent some time in Latvia, so maybe I can claim that I know this civil society not very good, but good. There's a big difference between civil society in the Western Balkans and in Baltic states. It's a very vibrant, very influential. NGOs are carriers of big changes. They're very much connected to the media sector. So what can civil society do is we do promote and we do build and we provide services and build capacities, and we are political players in the game. That's very obvious. But the issue is that there is a certain, level where we can go in cooperation with other institutions, and there is at one moment, a stop because of this approach that the partner are the governments. And I really want to say that because I think the partners in Romania in the protests for anti-corruption, in protests in Hungary, in protests in Poland, in all kinds of citizens' actions are, those are the partners. And I really want to say something about the journalist threat, if I can take 1 minute, because I think it's a very important issue. I think that we always forget, and that has been mentioned today a couple of times, the freedoms are all won over and over and over again. So at one moment when you have the freedom of the press, it doesn't mean that you will have it forever, that then there's not outside forces that will try to prevent that. So we sometimes, we snuggle in our nice democratic, beds, and we forget about that. And then it happens, there's a murder of a journalist, and we're like, oh. And also, there's huge problem in Europe also about the shrinking space for civil society, which is now a huge problem. Not only in Eastern Europe, like Civicus reports say that in Western Europe, there's a shrinking space for civil society. and if we are so developed on this level, this has to be, and civil society is media also, this has to be an alarm for us. So sorry if I'm really pessimistic, but I think that some lessons have to be learned all over again and have to be repeated so it really gets into our minds. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll have to find some answers also, so that I will leave it for discussion. What answers we would have to that. And we also have a guest from Romania. I will give you floor afterwards also. But now I'd like to turn to Rytis Zemkauskas. You are professor at the Latvia University, and you are also have been a rector of the University of Latvia, and had lectures all around the globe, so to say. Actually, you're an expert of quantum physics, and I was so eager to hear your story here, because you are, as a scientist, you had maybe a deep reflection on what's going on in Europe, and maybe what we should change or not change in these circumstances 100 years before and after, so that maybe we could have your story now.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, probably I should very briefly explain why doing research in quantum physics, teaching quantum mechanics at the university, I dare to be here and try to present you my opinion, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Latvia, and what should we do to have better perspective for ourselves, and especially for our children and grandchildren. The reason why I'm here is because for some months already, with some of my colleagues and my friends, we have some project here at the University of Latvia, and title of that project is Formula for Latvia 2050. Sorry. You'll see that probably looking for the, if we are comparing the title of this conference, there is some similarities. We are trying to look into the future mainly of Latvia, but of course if we are doing that, it's impossible to project what will be happening in Latvia if we are not looking what's happening around us, happening mainly in Europe, but of course outside the Europe as well. And so I think that this is why the reasons why we have thought for a couple of months about these issues, about future of Europe and processes which are happening in Europe. And probably I will share some of our feelings, not the final conclusions, because the final forum is still in the future. So we will have final conclusions only in the middle of summer, but currently we have already some thoughts about these processes. First of all, when we are looking into the first two panels which happened today about politics and economics, in these panels, in some sense, I feel more comfortable than in this panel. And I will explain why. Because being from science, being scientist myself, when I'm looking and discussing different economics issues, I always have a feeling that's something very understandable for me. Of course, not everybody will agree, but mainly many things in economics can be calculated. We have more or less exact mathematical models. If I would simplify these things, that everybody knows that in economics we have supply and demand, and we must balance these things, and if these things are balanced, then everybody is happy. And if we are looking what's happening in economics and in economical space in Europe, we are always speaking, and here today, that we are looking for more or less uniform Europe. We would like to have Eurozone extended. We would like to have banking sectors harmonized across Europe. So at the moment when things are happening more or less in the same way in different European parts, in different European countries, we think that we are achieving something. If we are looking from the political perspective, I think that things are not so clear, but more or less similar. Of course, we would like to have democratical societies all across Europe. There is some discussions what we mean by a democracy, what kind of democracy we are speaking about, and we thought these discussions today as well. But more or less we agree that we would like to have democratical societies across Europe. We would like to have a reduced corruption. We would like to have collective security provided either by our alliance or in NATO, or maybe we are looking in the last couple of years also for other mechanisms how to achieve this collective security. But again, we are speaking more or less about similar situation in different European parts of Europe, and when we are achieving that, we are saying that we are making good progress. And now we are coming to this panel, and why I said that this probably is most complicated discussion in my mind. We are speaking about people who are consumers of this economics, who are participants of these democracies. And when we are speaking about different nations and different countries in Europe, we are changing accents a little bit. Very often we are speaking about national identity. Then even today we are listening that we are speaking about European identity, that probably something a little bit broader. And when we are speaking about national identities, very often we are not so sure that everything should be happening in very similar way in all the parts of Europe. When we are coming to small nations like, for example, Latvia and our neighboring countries, Lithuania and Estonia, of course, as well, we are very often saying that we have our responsibility for our culture. We should preserve our culture, unique features of our culture. We should, of course, preserve our languages, and if we have small nations, that language issue always is very complicated, in some sense, very actively debated issue. Of course, then we have our history, and it's always a question how much we should focus to the local history, how much at school we should teach history of Latvia, or should we teach it from the very beginning like the part of the European history and maybe history of the at least Western world altogether. And these issues are starting to be much more complicated than when we are speaking about these political or economical issues. We know that many political parties and political movements and forces, especially before the elections and during the elections, but not only at that time, are exploring in different ways sentiment about language, culture, and all that. For example, in Latvia, and we are speaking about higher education, we have very heated debate happening right now, how much we should require language knowledge for professors who are elected as professors in different universities. In Latvia, for example, if you are electing somebody to be professor in chemistry, should he pass immediately before the election as a professor? There's some procedure how people are becoming professors in our country. Before becoming professor, should you pass language test already before elections, or should there be some time given before you are learning national language? And these are starting to be, I think, really complicated issues. If you are asking my opinion, I think that actually, of course, our responsibility for our language, culture, history is built in our society. The question is how you are doing that. Should you, in some sense, and I especially will exaggerate, build wall around language, let's say, issues, not allowing anybody who is not speaking Latvian into this community, this club. Or another option always is to be very open about your language, to be willing to tell everybody who is willing to listen about your culture, about your language, in the language which he is able and willing to understand. And in this way you can preserve your language, or you can, as I said, to guard it with some restrictions. There was some comments what we have the legacy from previous historical period. I'm always a little bit hesitant to speak that we have very bad legacy from Soviet time. Of course, we have it, but sometimes we are over-exploiting that and all our problems, trying to associate it with those times. I think that it's not always so simple, but I think that this feeling that everything should be strictly regulated, that we should forbid different things just in this way to guard our values, language, and things like that. I think that in this sense we are a little bit overdoing. Another issue, I think, which is very important. Of course, when we are speaking about this national identity, what we understand by national identity. From one sense, of course, it's our culture, our history, our way of living, how our parents lived, how our grandparents lived, and there is some value in that. And then, of course, we should balance this with what's happening in developing Europe. As I'm always saying, we are living in very dynamic time and in a very dynamic society, and we should balance these things. Sometimes we have feelings that regulations from outside, including regulations from European Union, are a little bit too strict. I guess that I will not be first who will say that Brexit in some sense was triggered by this very strong regulation from European Union, and I know some of my very well educated and kind of very respected friends in United Kingdom. One of the reasons they are saying, of course, they are trying to regulate our lifestyle, our heritage, and this is one of the reasons why we are trying to depart from this type of activities. And maybe some final point which I would say, okay, we have this national identity, we have European national identity, and of course we have something like that because I have very personal experience, just a couple of days coming back for 2 weeks in India. I was working for one of the universities of India, and then you are starting to understand that you don't have only Latvian national identity, you have something broader, European identity, which is different from how people think and how people feel outside Europe. But just really very final point, when we started this panel, there was one question: what kind of skills, what kind of what we should do as Europeans in this dynamical society differently than we are doing right now. What is needed to be successful in this dynamical society. And of course, risking to be a little bit too trivial, but I think that there is, again, some things and some balances which we should reach. One is, of course, in this very dynamical society, and probably many of you know this statistical data, that each day, including today, there's published 5,000 new titles of books. It means that it's totally impossible to follow all the information which is coming around. It means that probably the knowledge which is important, but maybe in the future will not be the most important skill to succeed in Europe, maybe and in world in general. Maybe it will be more important to be dynamical, to be able to assess information, to be able to learn quickly, but then there's another balance on this scale, because Recently, looking in the Facebook, I was seeing a very heavily advertised application for business people. And the advertisement went something like that. That successful business people are reading something like 500 books per year. I'm not sure how it's possible, but this is what was mentioned there. And then followed the second part. Of course, it's very hard. Then we will prepare synopsis of these books, very short kind of a summary of these books. And we'll be providing you with these summaries of these books. You are paying small fee for that, and you will be able to follow what's happening all around. Then I think that's coming the second part of this balance. When I'm looking at my experience, very often now I'm thinking that maybe I shouldn't read the new book. Maybe I should come back to a book which I read already 10 years ago and to read especially slowly that book, to be able to read, if it's necessary, each page 5 times, to think what is on that page. So I mean this ability to concentrate, to think about things, to assess these things. I think this is one really important skill into the 21st century, not only to be able to process information very fast, but to think about things. And maybe in this way we can be more successful in building of society. Maybe in this way we can be more successful in building our businesses, and actually in this way to be more successful to secure a future for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren.
Thank you. And to add to that, there was some survey, and there was experts who were saying that maybe the new skill of the future will be also the skill of the anger management. So the way how we control our anger and our stress, because maybe it is also quite accurate to have lessons of the 20th century to understand that we somehow need that new skill, how to control our controversies and anger. And now talking about emotions, feelings, and revolution and people, I would like to say that we have a last-minute guest from Romania, and my story about Romania is that I really was astonished when got to know the story of your people about the first demonstrations against the totalitarian regime in Timișoara, a city which will be also becoming the European capital of culture. So that we have today Mr. Doru Liciu from Romania. Romania also celebrates 100 years this year. Yes, maybe we could have your comments.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me here. And on behalf of the Romanian government and all Romanian citizens, I would like to address sincere congratulations for your centenary. Romania as well is celebrating its centenary, but is a centenary of its completion of the unity, of the national unity, a process which started almost 160 years ago. But I would like to jump in the main issue I would like to bring to the public. In any good dystopian novel, like in George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley, A Brave New World, you have a Ministry of Truth who is writing and rewriting the history. In the early 90s, when I visited the Western Europe for the first time, I was like a student in history. I was struck by the lack of knowledge about history of the average Western European citizen. Now working in a university like a teacher, I was struck by the same feeling when talking with the millennials, I was seeing that they don't know too much about their own history, not talking about the history of Europe. So the main threat is that those young people, those European citizens, are more likely to believe, to become victims of the fake news and productions of the Ministry of Truth. So I will launch this issue. What can we do to learn more history in schools and to help build this European identity? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, what can we do? I think that's really, we can analyze a lot, but in the end of the day, we need to do something about it. And that's why I would ask all of you on the panel, maybe your like a quick formula, what we could do as scientists, as civil activists, as researchers, as professors at universities. What can I do, what can we do in order to change things or to make this next 100 years as really peaceful and prosperous in Europe as we would like to? So maybe let's start again with Rytis.
Oh, that is a tough question. Well, one of the suggestions that I may offer is that we should be careful about history, which is obvious. And I like this joke very much, that my country has an unpredictable history. Which means that we write and rewrite it, and we are the Ministry of Truth. We the living, as the Swedish film director Anderson would say, we the living. We write and rewrite that history, because history is basically a set of stories. And the question, what is truth in there, is a very complicated question. So I am not very, very sure that we should base everything we do on history. To my mind, the present day is far more important. And sometimes I like to say that what unites us, no, not always, but it could be a useful thing. History mustn't be the most important thing that unites us. Our future must be the most important thing that unites us.
Sharunas.
Actually, my thinking is in a little bit different direction regarding all the discussions about this kind of rational arguments regarding how should we live, as if we have formula. And my colleague, who is a physicist, mentioned that it's well understood for him, for example, like economic laws, or for example, supply, demand, cost, benefit, etc., analysis. But in a sense, we have all to think ideologically and politically. Are we only a territory, one of the territories, or are we something else? And if we ask this question to ourselves, we start understanding that all these pure economic, let's say, categories which are used very often by the politicians who talk, for example, about cost-benefit analysis. If to apply this to everybody of you, it wouldn't pay to be born. You wouldn't cover your own, living in a sense, because somebody has to invest into your, the parents would invest into education, being born at the hospital, this and that, and even to be buried. It's better not to be born. It's better not to have Rail Baltica, because it will never pay. It just pays off because European Commission pays to it. So we have to think a little bit differently, not cost and benefit analysis, which is like widely spread with this accountancy culture. So the questions, you should raise about the very essence of your existence and of the existence of the country, finally. I'm not territorialist. I mean, don't take me, literally, but I'm not for the territorial state. I think, we can have, all kinds of confederations, etc., etc. But in principle, always raise ideological. What is the meaning of your existence? What is the meaning of the existence of the society? And when you apply these principles, you realize that most of the actions taken by the government, like optimization of the network of the schools or optimization of the network of the hospitals, they are completely destructive to the society. For example, we did research, our own on the social sustainability of the municipalities. Those municipalities which resisted central government attempts to optimize, to make smaller network of the schools, smaller network of the hospitals, they are much better off because people are not leaving the country, not leaving the place. Even if they are leaving for migrating for seasonal work as a construction workers into Ireland or whatever, Norway, etc., etc., they are coming because their families are over there. They have more comfortable life over there in their municipality. And the places where they literally take this economic logic, they're basically running down the country. So you have always to be, careful. So my advice is always, to think, ideologically and politically, and be political. Yeah.
Rados, you're a civil activist. What will you do?
Well, I think I have to repeat the sentence that I said at the end. I think it's really one of those things that people often say and then forget. I think it's very, first of all, we used to have the enemy of the progress in the past was lack of knowledge. Now the enemy of progress is most often disinformation or having very false information. So I think we have to invest in young people, and easily said than done. However, there has to be a new approach to how we deal with young people in all of these fields. We usually, in civil society, we tend to focus on young people as political beings, in the sense that normally states and the governments and systems ignore them until they have the right to vote. Or they organize small youth clubs, for etc. But I think it's very important to understand that we are living in 2018. Young people are also very political. So if you don't build their knowledge based in this manner, you will have problems in the future, definitely. And that is why the problem of, for example, of Brexit is that they didn't understand or didn't use power of young people. I'm pretty much sure if they used it completely, they would see how much the young people can influence their grandmothers who voted for Brexit. So I think that's very important, to focus on young people. And on a European level, I know everyone is talking about 1 million Erasmus babies and similar programs, but I think we're not doing enough to connect each other to understand. There's still people in Portugal who have no idea about Latvia. There's still people in Latvia who think that Montenegro is in Africa. I know that it sounds very silly, but it is true, and we have to find those people. In this room, we are 1%. We have to get out of it and share the real information with the people. Thank you.
Professor.
If I need to choose one idea to offer you today, maybe it will be the following. In some sense, it's a reflection to the one of the points which raised Madam President during this morning. She said that with some skepticism, that Latvia is a small, remote country on outskirts of Europe. Of course, probably it's not full truth, but you should admit that some sense in that is. My colleague from Montenegro said that when he's saying from where you are coming, so sometimes people are getting confused. Everybody from this audience can tell millions of funny stories. When you said that you are coming from Latvia, what was the reaction of people somewhere? It seems like a disadvantage, but actually I think it can be turned into a very big advantage. And I will try to explain why. I think that actually very young society, very dynamic society and very, very energetic society, what we are. I think that this being not exactly in the center of intellectual life of Europe can be very advantage. big advantage. And I will try to illustrate very briefly with some examples, or one example from physics. When you are creating something really new, if you are doing it in the big centers, you are doing it in community which is doing mainstream physics. And then it happens like, I would be quoting very approximately famous American writer Salinger. In one of his novels, he said, "It was so noisy that I hardly hear myself thinking." So if you are in this kind of environment when everybody is doing mainstream science, providing mainstream ideas, generating mainstream ideas, it's not so easy to generating something really innovative and something really new. And in physics, we know many examples when the brightest ideas happened somewhere outside the main centers, just because it was quieter, it was possibilities to think more slowly. There's nobody around you saying from the very beginning that you are stupid, this is an impossible idea, and so on. And I think being here in Baltic states in general, in particular in Latvia, we can generate these really innovative, really bright ideas, nurture them, ripen them here in Latvia, and then offer to the broader community. And this is, I think, our very big advantage.
Thank you. And as we have to take a few questions from the audience, before that I'd like to inform, because usually in the end of some news you have weather, yes, and so about the weather, we have 21 degrees outside, so maybe some good ideas have been in production there at the moment by the Baltic beach. But here in this audience, thank you so much for your patience and being here on this very sunny, beautiful day in Riga. And now it's time for your questions, if you would have some. We would have a time for like two. Maybe the microphone could be forwarded. It's a bit hard to see from here.
Thank you so.
Maybe you could also introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Victoria Molnar, student from Ukraine, but currently studying in Riga. So I've been wondering, several speakers were speaking about this European identity as something very common and something very abstract. And as far as I understand, the European Union as an institution was based on this idea of integration on the basis of values. But now we see the backslide in Eastern European countries when these values and these ideals of democracy are so easily forgotten and just put into the backslide of politics. So I would like to ask you whether this is a Sovietism that was mentioned, or is it really the fact that there is no common basic European identity? Thank you.
Whom you would like to ask?
I think all of the speakers.
Maybe who is ready to answer? Okay, Rados.
Very, very short, not to bore you with the academic side of because there's a lot of people researching this, let's call it phenomenon. I think the biggest problem is why we cannot grasp what European identity is. Usually identities, when it comes to national identity, first you have the identity or something similar to it, then you create institutions. But when it comes to the European Union, it is the other way around. First of all, you had the institutions out of very practical reasons. I mean, the values are to be discussed, you know, how much were they influenced in this. Then, when you create institutions, you remember, well, there is something that should, you know, more than like contracts and agreements that should bind us all. It is very hard to determine what the European identity is, but I think that you are on a right track of understanding what are the European values, and they are the grind for building the European identity. But because we didn't discuss it, this topic is not really never open in the offices of the European Commission or the Council, to be very honest. And it is being, for a right that reason, because we still don't have the right answers to it. It's not that everyone is running away from it, but because there is a lack of discussion about it and a huge grasp what it really is, then you have these problems, you have illiberal democracies, etc., etc. So I think young people need to open this discussion, and I see that in the future period it will be one of the most important topics if there should be a real reform of the EU as it is. And looking at what Prime Minister Macron and the others are saying, something has to happen in this field also.
Yes, Professor.
May I have very briefly. Actually, my feeling is that when we are speaking about identity, national identity, European identity, we are going to the field which is humanities, and which is not hard science. And if you are going into the field of humanities, very many things are determined by your feeling, by your experience, by your emotion, which is very hard to quantify. And if we are starting from national identity, then of course there's kind of lifestyle which our parents and grandparents lived, and it is somehow in our bloodstream, and we are feeling that this is somehow how we identify ourselves. And if we are going to the level of European identity, of course, sometimes we should sacrifice something from that, or somehow balance these things. And it's a very complicated issue and very difficult issue. But I think the one way how to start to feel more European is to try to live a little bit, or short period at least, short period of time outside Europe. As I said, I just came back from India for a couple of weeks in India, and then again on the emotional level, just very brief comparison. You are going to some church somewhere in Europe. Feeling is that I'm not a believer. I am even not Christian. But feeling inside the church, it's something very familiar. You are faith. You are feeling that somehow this is I belong to this society. And then you are going to some very famous temple somewhere in India. It's very interesting. It's very... you can learn a lot of things there, but first feeling, and not only first feeling is something different. I don't belong to this particular place. I don't belong to this particular way of thinking about different things. So I would say that these are kind of not exactly explanation, but it's kind of feeling what it means to be European, what it means to be Latvian, what it means to be Lithuanian. And definitely this is not so simple issue that on these European values we easily will build European society, because these European values, as you said, actually in different regions of Europe, in different countries of Europe, means a little bit different things, and sometimes contradictory things.
Rytis, please, if you could be very short.
Yeah, I would just like to add that this identity question in the European Union, to my mind, always is somehow becomes connected with the nationality question. And to me, it is not natural for Europe. I think it comes directly from Marxism, from Communist Manifesto, that Europe will become a melting pot and a new supranational nationality will emerge. He was wrong. History proved that. And I think when we speak about the European identity, it could be more productive to turn back to the founding fathers of the European Union, and they spoke about the culture of peace instead of culture of warfare, culture of consensus instead of culture of dictatorship, and so on. So when we speak about European identity, I think it could be more productive to speak about culture. Renaissance is a cultural phenomenon, and it happened in Italy, it happened in England, it happened in Germany, in Baltic states and Balkans, and Renaissance is very much European.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Yeah, and so it's basically scholarly. I mean, if to take from academic point of view, the question is very interesting, but at the same time, there are very clear answers. I mean, European identity is measured, and it's measured by all kinds of organizations, and there are all kinds of surveys done every year in different corners of Europe. So the first criteria which is measured is adherence to liberal democracy. Okay. Then public policy based on pluralism. I mean, nobody can have a monopoly, in a sense, dictate saying, you know, how, for example, the railway should be built in a certain locality if you don't ask the locals or everybody who has interest, etc., etc. Rule of law, multiculturalism to a certain extent, though, I mean, there are discussions in different countries. I mean, it's like they take very different position on these issues, even starting from French, ending with the rest of Europe. Then how you relate to the European institutions. I mean, do you have certain, you know, identification with European institutions? And those who were on Erasmus, those 1 million born or who were, I mean, those who participated in Erasmus and in some universities, like in our university, nearly from our faculty, probably most of the students participated in Erasmus. So their loyal, in a sense, their identification with European institutions and with Europe is very, very strong. So once you have all kinds of mechanisms that are helping, you know, movement around, who are helping the mechanisms that are helping, you know, integration. Merger, communication, etc., etc. Usually you have very positive results. So I'm not skeptical, and I'm not saying that, you know, there is a kind of backslide on European identity, that nobody identifies with Europe, nobody understands what's Europe about. It's not only bureaucracy. I mean, in all the censuses you have, even in places like Poland, you have around 25–30% of the youngsters from 16 years old up to 39, I mean, who would say that they are first European, but not, and then Polish. I mean, the data can differ, you know, few percents here or there, but overall the tendency is that, you know, people feel more and more European.
Thank you, and we have only time for maybe 2 questions combined on this side, maybe?
I have the microphone.
Yes, okay.
Valda Lieping, Luxembourg Latvian Association. I just wanted to comment very briefly that it seems to me that in all of the discussions today, we've basically missed one part of the jigsaw. We've skirted around it, we've alluded to it, and that would be historically the exile communities, particularly for the Baltic states, and for the present and the future, looking beyond to this 100, is the diaspora communities. And we've skirted around demographic issues, territorial issues, Erasmus, etc. I'm not asking this as a question, it is only a comment for future consideration and discussion that we can't ignore what happened with how much the exile communities helped regain democracy in the Baltic states, and we can't ignore the size of the diasporas and their impact on the future of our Baltic states.
Thank you, and here, yes.
Hi, my name is Silver Tambur. I'm Estonian World, which is one of the Estonian English language media outlets. Specifically a question for Rados, but obviously if others want to join in. You mentioned, or you cited the research that said that there's a shrinking space for civil society in Europe. From the Estonian experience, I would say it's vice versa. I mean, the civil society has developed a lot in last 10 years, immensely. And I would imagine the same applies to Latvia. What, in your opinion, what are the reasons, if you've obviously, I assume you've read the research, what are the reasons for the shrinking space, as you said, and what could be done to improve that? And also briefly, I would imagine from your experience from Montenegro, where the civil society is, I would imagine, quite young, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you can quickly maybe share some tips from your experience in Montenegro, it would be interesting to hear. Could we, I mean, Europeans, learn something from your experience in Montenegro? I would imagine it's been probably a tough process and ongoing process in your country. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me first go to the second question. The issue with is Montenegrins would be crazy if I would be very angry if I would say young countries. By independence, it is young. By the statehood, it isn't. It's very old, but it doesn't matter. The civil society started growing in the 90s. And the problem with, if we focus on Montenegro, we can do it in other Western Balkans countries, that you really didn't have any opposition to, like opposition political parties that are any functional or effective. You didn't have any unions and universities that were really active. So there was this huge democratic gap. And that was taken intentionally somewhere, somewhere not, by the NGOs. And in the Balkans, NGOs are equal civil society, mostly, sometimes media, but NGOs and media, that is. And what happened in the 90s, it grew a lot. It became a huge player in the processes. It gained a lot of support by the citizens. All the protests in Montenegro and other ex-EU countries are mostly organized by the NGOs. So it has a huge visibility. They have great connection with the media, and they, in the 90s, had a huge support from the international community. Now, in 2018, the space is shrinking because NGOs are mostly, the donors are gone, obviously because the countries have progressed, and there's only one donor, is the Commission, which usually uses very, bureaucratic, technical project management wording, blah, blah, blah. And it creates, not intentionally, but it does create this problem with the NGOs that they have become a bureaucratic apparatus, in the sense that they just produce, and there's no real activism there. However, still they're a huge political player in the region, and they are still, unfortunately, because of the lack of really functional still opposition in 2018 in all of these countries, they are under fire from, I'm going to use the word of the European Commission, how they call the Balkan countries, captured states. So they're under fire from all of these political elites that are under power, and I'm not quite sure, and that's the shrinking space in the Western Balkans. In Europe, what Civicus noticed, and this can is that it's connected to the also media attacks, also on pressuring civil society organizations in Hungary, in Poland, and in similar countries, and also in Western Europe. Unfortunately, because of also the bureaucratic nature and the progress of these countries, there's a lot of real activism there. But there's a huge difference because unions in France and unions in Poland, not in Poland, unions in the Balkans are completely different. I would say that we take civil society as for granted a lot. And we do not understand what is the power of civil society in Europe. It is often said that the civil society is a huge contributor to the European Union and all the processes of the political processes, but I'm afraid that often they're a key player, that they're a player that sits on the table but doesn't have a huge voice, and that has to be solved. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. I'm very sorry that we have to end this beautiful conference and beautiful panel here. But to summarize in very short what we have talked today at this panel, I would like just to say in very few words. Actually, wherever you are in Europe today, whatever profession you are in today, actually you can be part of that civic diplomacy. You can be a center of Europe yourself, to prove those values of common Europe, to prove those values of rule of law, to prove the values of democracy and rights of every person. Actually, you do not have to wait from anybody else to do and to implement those values in your everyday life. So with that positive note, I hope, I would like to end here, to thank you all for your patience and to thank all the 4 distinguished speakers. And before that, before we go and join you in the audience, I would like to give the floor to Associate Professor of the University of Latvia, Ivars Ieps, who will do some conclusions for us. He does it usually in a very exciting way and manner, and I think that we even will not manage to go in the first row, so we'll listen from here.
Thank you very much, Aiva. Yeah, I have this difficult task to summarize. It's somehow, I'll be short. I won't be keeping you very long from that 21 centigrade sunny weather outside, so I will tell just a couple of words about what my reflections were when listening to this excellent conference, which really provided us with a really impressive panorama of achievements and problems these countries, these rather various countries, have had during these last 100 years. And my sense is that still we have some kind of continuity, in a sense that 1918 is when the states were founded. That was a moment of a huge ambition of that period. That was an extremely ambitious project, these 10 countries, because we wanted, at that point of time, we really wanted to be part of the Premier League, if you want, in the world politics, because these countries were rather diverse, but some of them were, let's say, not so advanced in many ways. For example, in one of the regions of Latvia and in Lithuania and in Ukraine, the serfdom was abolished only in 1861, but a little bit more than 50 years later, these countries want to be the most advanced countries of that period, which means they wanted to be democracies, pluralistic democracies with a universal suffrage, which was a really advanced project of that period. That was invented, actually, and the very idea came only in the late stages of the First World War. They wanted to be republics, and most of them were, with the possible exception of the kingdom of Serbs and Croats, what we now call the Yugoslav kingdom, which was the only monarchy, but all the rest were republics, and they were free market democracies. And that was a moment of huge ambition, and I think that we are still the heirs of that legacy, of that huge ambition, that we want to be the part of the Premier League of the world politics. We just don't want to be different from the what we nowadays call the West. We want to be the part of one whole and free Europe. And this ambition is still very much an issue in our times. Of course, these totalitarian experiences of the 20th century, which were mentioned many times today, were a kind of a setback in that development, without any doubt. And this is what we experienced. Some of the countries experienced this for long periods of time, like Latvia. We were actually occupied for 50 years. Some countries had shorter experiences with totalitarianism, like countries like Austria, for example, or Finland, which is still a dubious question whether Finland had an experience with a totalitarian regime, but nevertheless, they had that experience. And of course, that was a setback, but nowadays we are, of course, trying to go forward, trying to move forward, and just as I said before, that the ambition was huge, because before the First World War, these were to a large extent peasant societies. Not all of them. Some of them, like the Czechoslovakia, was much more advanced than, let's say, some of the parts of the Russian Empire. In political terms, some of the countries had some kind of self-rule or let's say, autonomy, like Finland, for example. Of course, the Habsburg Empire was also different from the Ottoman and Romanov empires. But nevertheless, the ambition was huge that in that circumstances, we wanted to create really the most advanced political and economic systems. And this is what we still are trying to do. But nevertheless, there is also not just a continuity of ambition, but there is also a continuity of problems, or if you want, as we call it nowadays, challenges. The first one is, of course, the usual problem. The usual problem is that both pluralist democracy and free market economy work on the long run. But in this region, it has been extremely difficult to get that long run because of different issues. First of all, because of imperial ambitions of certain of our neighbors, because of, let's say, popularity of authoritarian and totalitarian ideologies, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, that was the hugest challenge to get that long run, and I think that now, 28 years after the Soviet Union broke down, I think that we are in the best possible position to continue that ambition and to stick with this ambition to create more advanced democracies and free market economies. Of course, if we are talking about the democratic challenges, the challenges for the democratic regimes, yes, it's true that democracy is, of course, nowadays the only game in the town, because there are no such totalitarian and authoritarian alternatives visible as they were visible in the interwar period. But nevertheless, we experience a certain dissatisfaction with the efficiency of the democratic regimes. And that's why these populist and other right-wing authoritarian tendencies are growing everywhere in Europe. Of course, one of the biggest challenges we also, which were also mentioned in the economic panel, was about the reform capacity. To what extent are these democratic countries capable of introducing the necessary reforms? Which is not always very well compatible with the democratic pluralism, with all the democratic procedures, and so on and so forth. This is still an issue, as well as the sustainability of the welfare systems, which is a huge problem we have to deal with in many of those countries because of the demographic issues, because people are aging and people are leaving for obvious reasons, some of our countries. And the third challenge is very much the same. We have still, if you want, security issues or security challenges with some of our neighbors who are still thinking in the categories of the politics as a zero-sum game, of international cooperation as a zero-sum game. And the problem is that, of course, the European Union and the Europe in general, after the Soviet Union broke down, was based on different principles. That was based on on cooperation, increased cooperation as the best way to achieve peace and prosperity. So this security issue is still very much an issue of the conflict of two possible ways of approaching international politics in general. And let me finish with saying that the future of Europe, which is the usual topic of such conferences, is decided not somewhere in Brussels or in Strasbourg. Of course, international institutions are extremely important, and they have been extremely helpful in creating peace and prosperity in our region. But nevertheless, what is more important is our domestic challenges, which shouldn't be somehow excused on behalf of our communist or other totalitarian past, and we shouldn't also, let's say, overemphasize all the external threats as a possible excuses for not doing our own job in our domestic politics. So let's quote Voltaire. This is to a large extent still the question how we tend our own gardens. So thank you very much, and on behalf of the organizers, I just want to thank you all for your patient presence here. I just want to say you big thank you from the three organizers of this conference, which are the Latvian Institute, the representation of the European Commission in Latvia, and the Latvian Association of Political Science. Thank you very much, and the conference is closed.